there is more going on in this gospel than what first meets the eye. There's a very interesting detail that we're not given until the very end. The fact that one of these 10 lepers is a Samaritan. And if you will recall, if you think of the story of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well, then you've heard at least that in Jesus' time, Jews and Samaritans had nothing to do with one another. If you were to think of the situation in the Holy Land today, of how the interactions are between Israelis and Palestinians, it gives you a pretty good idea of how much Jews and Samaritans at the time of Jesus got along. They were bitter enemies. Their rivalry often broke out in violence, riots. They despised one another. They both claimed to worship God, but they had different rules for it. And they were separate. That is, except perhaps in cases like this, when all other illusions of any kind of independence or health or status or prestige were stripped away. As so often is the case when we are faced with suffering in life, deep, bitter suffering. We human beings have a tendency among ourselves to create in-groups and out-groups, to sort the people in the world around us into various categories. And we learn over time various prejudices, how to discriminate. There are ways that we then impose these categories on ourselves. And we start thinking, well, this is not good enough for me. Or sometimes even, this, that, or the other thing might be too good for me. We put those around us in little boxes, and we put ourselves in boxes too. Until something happens that strips all of those illusions of separation away and forces us to recognize what we all share in common. And it could be almost anything that brings with it enough suffering. When we go to our doctor and we hear those words, "You have cancer," or, "I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do." When we find ourselves injured and we hear, "You will never walk again." Or maybe when it's the loss of a loved one, and we have to come to terms with the fact that we are now a widow or a widower, having to relearn how to live life itself. Those moments have a tendency, especially if we are able to cling to faith in God, to actually open us up, to break us out of all of those little boxes that what we might call normal life allows us to construct, and the various categories that we put people in. When I am in deep suffering and I encounter another in the same suffering, this creates a moment for empathy, a moment where we can identify with one another. I'm reminded of the story of Saint Damien of Molokai, a priest who went to minister to a colony of lepers. When he first arrived, very, very few of the members of that colony were Christian, let alone Catholic. But over time, in his work there, by the time he died, something like 90% of that colony had converted and joined the church. And when he would address his congregation, he would always refer to them as my fellow lepers. And he did indeed eventually contract that infection himself, and in time it would take his life. We can hear of violent events around the world, mass shootings, natural disasters. We can hear of people who suffer greatly, and if we're honest with ourselves, we have to admit there are sometimes we hear such stories and we think to ourselves, oh my gosh, that is so awful. And yet there are other times we hear such stories and we think to ourselves, yep, that's how they are. And so the question for us is, when we face opportunities in our suffering to have those walls broken down, what will we do? This group of 10 lepers gives us an indication of what we could hope for. This story the church wants us to hear as an echo of this miracle worked in the time of Elisha the prophet. That was the first story we heard today, where Naaman, this foreigner, this Syrian, at the time the arch rival of the people of God, the Israelites, he had heard from an Israelite servant when he contracted the disease. Oh, you know, if only you could go to where I'm from. We have a great prophet there. He could take care of this issue, no problem. That's why he seeks Elisha out in the first place. And he comes to recognize, there is no God in all the earth except this God whom you Israelites worship. And we have here these 10 lepers, 9 of whom are Jews, 1 of whom is a Samaritan. And in spite of all of the normal divisions that would have typically kept them apart, the suffering of this disease, the exclusion from the rest of the society, has thrown them all together to recognize they do indeed have a common lot. And together, they seek out Jesus. As people of faith, if we can cling to our faith, if we can maintain that trust in Jesus, especially in the midst of suffering, the opportunity is that all of those divisions, all of those in-groups or out-groups with which we have conceived the world, the barriers can fade away, allowing us to open our hearts to them. And perhaps when they have put us in similar categories, but they are now in a situation where all illusions have stripped away, they can find some solidarity with us. And if in that we continue trusting in Jesus, perhaps we can then even be the vehicle to bring them in. It is easy to imagine that these 9 Jewish lepers, having heard stories of this Jesus who was going around healing people, dispelling demons and so on, said to this Samaritan, "Look, we know you don't usually want to have anything to do with us, but come on. Let's go give this guy a chance. Let's see if maybe he can do something for us." And Jesus does indeed do something for him. 2 things, actually. Not only does he heal this man's disease, but the eyes of this man's heart are opened. A subtle point. Jesus says to the group, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." What priests? If not the Jewish priests, the ones according to the law, to whom a leper had to go if that person was cured, to verify the cure, to be welcomed back into the community. This is where Jesus sends all of these men. And perhaps maybe as he was on the way wondering, well, what are they going to do when I, a Samaritan, get to them? That's when he notices he's cured. And he comes through that to know Jesus. There will be times we will face suffering. It's inevitable. We will get those diagnoses from our doctors that we dread, or a loved one will, or we'll have some sort of change of our state in life, employed to unemployed, wealthy to poor. Or we will have to realize we have an addiction we cannot combat on our own, and that could be to anything. And we are going to find ourselves having stripped away from us every false identity, every false foundation of our self-dignity. It's not going to be a pleasant experience, but when it happens, will we maintain our faith? Will we continue going to Jesus? Will we accept the opportunity in that suffering, when all of these barriers can be stripped away, not only to keep going to him for ourselves, but perhaps to even lead others to him? When the day comes, what will you do? Peace be with all of you this day and with all who love the Lord in simplicity of heart.